Today's keynote speaker is a professor of international and global history at Columbia University. He is co-director of the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy and principal investigator of History Lab, a project to apply data science to the problem of preserving the public record and accelerating its release. His publications include A Diplomatic Revolution, Algeria's Fight for Independence and the Origins of the Post-Cold War Era, which won 5 prizes, and Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population, an Economist and Financial Times Book of the Year. His most recent book, The Declassification Engine, What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets, was just published by Random House. He has worked in more than 50 archives in a dozen countries and published scholarly articles in a number of publications, including, but not limited to, Nature, Human Behavior, Annals of Applied Statistics, Comparative Studies in Society and History, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, and the American Historical Review. He has also provided commentary on international affairs for the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Le Monde, and has hosted documentaries for BBC Radio. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Matthew Connolly. Matt, the stage is now yours.
Thank you so much, Reese. I also want to thank the ARMA Metro NYC chapter for hosting me. Also the organizers, especially David Smith, who's the one who first reached out to me. And when first I heard from David, I was excited because it's rare that I get to talk to a group of information management professionals. So, historians like me, whether we realize it or not, almost all our work depends on your work. So it's really important, I think, that we talk to each other and learn from each other. So I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. But if at any point you have questions or things are unclear, I'm happy to take your questions in the course of the presentation. All right, so I want to talk to you today about, this is a challenge, I know that many of you have been dealing with for decades already, but it's something that even historians are finally starting to realize. That is how it is the transition from paper to digital records, and the fact that more and more of these records have confidential information, whether it's private information or, in this case, national security information. This is posing, immense challenges, for the project of trying to preserve a public record and making sure that eventually the public has access to it. So I'll be focusing today on the challenges of the United States government in meeting its legal mandates to be accountable to the American people. But in the course of the talk, and especially I hope in the Q&A, we might talk about how some of these same kinds of issues are common, to information governance professionals in the various kinds of organizations in which they work. But to begin with, I'll be doing this in 3 parts. I just want to quantify as nearly as we can, just get a measure of the scale of the problem that I'll be talking about, the growth in classified records and what I would call the collapse in the declassification of those records, the review of these records for release to the public. Then I'll be talking about how it is that these kinds of challenges are really changing the way people like me do our work. That is how it is we try to explore the past and derive its lessons. And the work we historians do is actually the basis for a lot of the work that people do in the humanities and the social sciences. So if historians are going to struggle, to get access to records and to understand them in the new forms in which they're coming to us, then I think it's going to pose real challenges just for the academy generally, to those of us, who depend on public information or information from the private sector for that matter, to try to understand the world as it is and how it came to be that way. And then finally, and there's a reason why this image isn't loading, I want to talk to you about some of the work I've been doing at Columbia with colleagues in data science and statistics, trying to develop new machine learning techniques to automate and hopefully accelerate, at least to some extent, the review of sensitive records so that they can be released to the public. Now, when I first created this presentation, for some reason it didn't load the image of what at least one artist thinks a declassification engine can look like. But in a way, I thought that was only fitting because much of what I'll be talking about is about secrecy. But I'll show you a picture by the end so you can get the sense, at least, of what some artists think it might look like. All right, so how do we get a handle on the dimensions of this? And again, this is really about the US government and its production of classified information. Now, to begin with, if you wanted to know, how records get reviewed and released, and you, like me, were tracking these trends all the way back in the 1990s. That was when I was a PhD student studying diplomatic history. You could see that during this period of the Cold War, relatively few records were reviewed and released to the public. But after the end of the Cold War, there was a real boom, at least for a time, when it got to the point in the late 90s where some 200 million pages were getting reviewed and released each year. Now, that doesn't mean that these records necessarily ended up on the shelves of archives. That's the final yard, or the last mile even. And unfortunately, like all too many of these records still sit in record centers. They haven't been reviewed and processed by archives so that the public can access them. But still, it seemed, at least in terms of the problem of official secrecy, that the US government was making a real effort to be more accountable to the public. Now, this effort faltered around 20 years ago, and ever since, we've seen little, in the way of a real effort by the U.S. government to review records and make sure that the public has access to them. Now, this isn't because there are fewer records to review and release. It's not as if, all those records that accumulated in the Cold War, once they were reviewed and delivered to the public, that was the end of the story. In fact, as near as we can measure it, the U.S. government was creating even more secrets in more recent history. Now, all this data comes from the same Information Security Oversight Office, the same part of our government that has the mandate, to track trends in declassification and classification. And this particular graph depends on self-reported data. So these are people in government. I think in some cases your counterparts, working for the CIA and the Defense Department and so on, who have to estimate, how many times each year officials will decide something is secret and has to be protected for some decades. And as you can see, there was really dramatic growth, in the period, especially during the first years of the Obama administration. And for a time, after 2012, after the point at which it was over 90 million times a year, or 3 times every second, that some official decided to classify information, it seemed that perhaps they were getting a handle on this and beginning to reduce what everyone agreed was overclassification. But this graph ends like the other ones do in 2017. The reason for that is at that point, the Information Security Oversight Office announced that they couldn't trust these figures. They actually didn't have reliable means even to estimate how many new secrets were being created each year. And in their most recent report, this was released last summer, they tried and ultimately failed just to enumerate the number of so-called special access programs. These are the compartments inside our government where they produce, sensitive compartmented information that can only be reviewed in SCIFs. They tried at least to have a census of how many programs such as this there are in the U.S. government. And in the end, they gave up. They just couldn't even gather this information, much less enumerate how many times officials classify information every year. Now, if you want to get a sense, of what all of this costs, as you can see, by 2017, the last time they produced this figure, it was $18.4 billion. Now, that's more than 50% more than the budget of the U.S. Treasury Department. So I like to say that if this was like a Harry Potter novel, and we had a Ministry of Secrets, but in this case, in the U.S., it would be a Department of Secrets. That department would be one of the larger parts of our federal government. It would take its place among some of the larger departments in the federal bureaucracy. And as you can see, this number, was almost double the number from 2012. And the reason for that, as we'll see in a moment, as many people think it's because of the Snowden leaks and the way that led to massive investment in information technology. But what it all means, basically, is that there is a lot of classified information that is not getting reviewed by anyone. And the reason for that, it really, in part, a large part of it comes down to money. And so this is a breakdown. It only goes to 2015. I didn't update this for the last 2 years that are available. But what you can see is how much of this, is going, for items like protection and maintenance of classified information systems, right? This is a large part of their spending. Personnel security, a significant item, so too is physical security. But more than anything, it's spending on IT, on management consultants, on information systems and software and so on. That's accounting for more and more, a larger and larger proportion of this spending. Now, it's included in this budget is the amount of money that's spent on declassification. You see this item right here? So appropriately enough, the color here is white. And I did that so you could make out, how much of this is going towards the review and release of public records. You'll see that for a little while, at the end of the 1990s, it amounted to something like 2%, right? 2% of the total of keeping information secret was devoted to deciding which of these records could be released to the public when it no longer endangered national security. Now we're down to barely 0.5%. So as of 2017, when it was some $18.4 billion being spent on state secrecy, it was only barely $100 million that was being spent on the review and release of those records to the public. So I think a little bit what our president, Joe Biden, says when he's told about the priorities, right, of different parties and political figures. And he'll say, don't believe what they say. Look at what they spend their money on, right? Their budget. This is what tells you what they actually care about. And so this tells you what our government actually cares about when it comes to accountability and transparency to the American public. Now, it's not only about the money. There's also a whole host of laws and regulations that stipulate the conditions under which a record gets reviewed and released to the public. And it's a Rube Goldberg machine. The same part of our government, the Information Security Oversight Office, helped the Public Interest Declassification Board, which I'll be talking about in a moment, draw up this schematic that was meant to show what it takes, even for one individual federal record to get reviewed and released to the public. And as you can see, it's an incredibly convoluted and complicated process. I'll just focus on one part of it for a moment. This is the part related to what's called restricted data, or formerly restricted data. This is information related to nuclear weapons. And what you can see is that by law, this is something that was introduced back in 1998 by Congress to try to stop the spread of weapons of mass destruction. By law, Congress required that any record that might have information related to WMDs, and especially nuclear information, has to be reviewed page by page to ensure that this kind of information, dangerous information, doesn't get out into the wild. And what you can see is that the Department of Energy will do a sample, right? They sample records that are about to get released, and then they decide if any of them might have nuclear information. And if they fail, right, if they find that some of those records actually did have something that could be seen as restricted data, then all of it has to get reviewed again, page by page, right? So this is one of the reasons beyond money why so little information gets released to the public. Now, people like me in my part of the world, we think, that perhaps eventually, these records will, get reviewed. I think that many of us, though, in my part of the world, we're not familiar with what it would take, for the immensity of records, to get reviewed, released to the public. Just recently, Jason Barron, who is head of litigation for the National Archives and Records Administration, he estimated that currently about 0.1% of electronic records are actually getting reviewed, right? So just think of it. It used to be the National Archives would estimate that 1 to 3% of the original documentary record, would get preserved and eventually shared with the American people. So now we're down to 0.1%. And in a moment, I'll show you what that looks like, right? How that process works when they're actually reviewing electronic records. But, if you're looking now at this picture, it's hard to take your eyes off it. This is the nightmare. Back in the old day when we were dealing with paper records, at least mainly, the concern was that, if you were trying to hold on to these records for decades and perhaps centuries, the real worry was that these records might at some point be destroyed, right, by accident or maybe even purposefully. And so this is an example of perhaps the greatest, disaster from the point of view of the National Archives and Records Administration. It's the 1973 St. Louis fire, where the Federal Records Center there caught fire and burned for almost a week, right? It took almost a week for them finally to put this out. And it's why many millions of military records were destroyed, to the point where it can be difficult to establish, somebody's military service to determine whether they're eligible for benefits of various kinds. And, it still is, a textbook case of malpractice. They had just rows upon rows of file cabinets full of paper. There was no sprinkler system. There were no fire doors. And the worst thing of all, I think, is that there was no off-site inventory of what records were being kept in the St. Louis Federal Records Center. So they didn't even know what was lost, right, when they finally put the fire out. And they still don't know. that they are making heroic efforts, right, to recover what they can. But I would submit to you, I know this is going to sound a little bit odd, but it so happens the summer of 1973, when this happened, was also the moment when the U.S. federal government began using electronic record systems to keep paper, what used to be, textual records, right, paper files. Of course, they'd used electronic record systems before then, but this was the beginning of really large-scale introduction of using electronic record systems for textual records, and it began in the State Department. And what I want to show you is, for a few moments, I want to digress in a way I hope information governance professionals will appreciate. I want to get at what the origins were of this decision, to move to electronic records. And what I want to show you is how, interestingly, it basically began with the Pentagon Papers case. Because it was in 1971 when these leaks began, right? And Daniel Ellsberg began to deliver thousands of pages of records, to various American newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times and so on. And the Nixon administration initially didn't know the source of these leaks. And so they ordered an investigation. And you can see how it is, this is a memorandum from Ehrlichman and Bud Crow, David Young, three of the so-called White House plumbers, who described, the status of this investigation once they realized it was Ellsberg, and they were trying to figure out, how this happened. And what they did, among other things, was they tried to do an analysis of everybody, who'd had access to these records, right? The distribution list, to get a sense of who, just reducing the numbers of people anyway, whether they could reduce it to a manageable list of suspects, right, to track them down. And they found that it was really difficult to do. And this is something, even more recently, when people wondered, how is it these top secret records could go missing? This is a persistent problem, right, of tracking the distribution of records and who had access to them. But the idea, anyway, the theory was that an electronic record system with a data index would make it easier going forward to find the source of leaks. And this was written up as one of the recommendations in a report that came out of the Justice Department. This report was actually led by William Rehnquist, who was a senior Justice Department official, and later on he would go on to be Nixon's pick to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And interestingly, this Rehnquist committee, learned about the way in which different parts of government, including the State Department, were carrying out experiments, to develop electronic record systems, in part because they wanted to be able to analyze their own communications flow. But they realized that this would be a way in which they could more easily track, who had access to different records, and ultimately to find the leakers of these records. So this is just an image of what that study looked at in terms of how the State Department was carrying on this research. They realized you're looking at a State Department communication from the 1966, actually, when they began doing this kind of work. And you can see how they, on the left-hand side here, they're identifying the distribution list, the numbers of copies that would go to different parts of the government. And this was the kind of metadata that they wanted to extract or generate when developing records like this in the course of State Department communications. And this describes, how it is they were going to take that kind of information, put it in key punch cards, right? And over time, gradually develop a data index, right? That could be rapidly consulted, so you could immediately see, by process of elimination, which individuals would have had access to which records. To me, there's a real irony in this because, they were implementing this system, at least in part, in order to identify leakers of information. But, this same system, as we'll see in a moment, when used for the Central Foreign Policy files for the U.S. State Department, this was the reason why, many decades later, why it is that Chelsea Manning, as an Army private, was able to access 250,000 State Department diplomatic cables and eventually leak that to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. So the irony is, this system that was meant to track down leakers made it possible for at least some of these leakers to leak on a scale that Daniel Ellsberg could only dream of. All right, so what I'm talking about in the next few slides is what this means, for people who would like to do research about the history of American foreign policy, or anything else for that matter, that relates to electronic records. Now, people like me, if we were trained as I was back in the 90s, and even now, this is still how we train, most of our students. We tell them about how if they want to, explore the past, typically that means going to archives and dealing with information management professionals like archivists. This was the Archivist of the United States some years ago. And the picture is from, this beautiful reading room on the mall in Washington, right, where they have the original National Archives building. And you can see, of course, these Hollinger boxes, and you can imagine these researchers, using finding aids and figuring out the original order of these records, right, their provenance. And also, once they begin ordering these boxes, like finding things, right? And also sometimes finding things they weren't looking for. Because, in the course of looking through files, you can see how they're arranged. And sometimes you can learn a lot, right, about an organization and an individual just to track that paper flow and to see how those papers were arranged, just to get a sense about what their priorities were, what they were dealing with on any particular day and so on. Well, a lot of my colleagues in history and other disciplines, we don't realize that this world is in many ways passing away, right? And one reason for that is because of the advent of electronic record systems and decisions that were made as to how it is that you can sort through these records and store them and eventually make them available to the public. Now, of course, one of the first things they decided, this is 1973, is they could destroy all the paper records. Like all those original airgrams and diplomatic telegrams and so on. Like once they had extracted the metadata and the text, and they recorded this on magnetic reels or microfilm, then they were going to go ahead and they were going to destroy all the originals. Now this is required in the US government, it still is, that they have to get permission for the National Archives for anyone, including the Department of State, to destroy any records that might have historical value. Now, of course, they said that they were going to preserve those records where the original record itself had real meaning, like if it had original signatures or stamps, like you're thinking about an international treaty, for instance. So that would be preserved. Otherwise, everything would be destroyed, right? After they decided that they had met these regulations to substitute for paper records. Now that's, in effect, where their problems began. Because over the years, we still don't know when, and the people at the National Archives would say they never really got an answer from the State Department. A lot of those original records were corrupted. And if you try to look them up on the National Archives website, you'll find that there are whole weeks of missing records. And so this is a quotation. Instead of a finding aid, you now find this kind of description in a FAQ, right? There's no finding aid for the Central Foreign Policy files any longer. Instead, you find these FAQs, and they explain like how it is that many of these records are corrupted and missing. And as it so happens, this is the part I inserted myself, you see how these same periods of history correspond with some of the more important episodes in American history. Now, it's a little bit suspicious, that this happened, during the period when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. Kissinger famously said, that he didn't want things committed to paper. He even said at one point, everything on paper will be used against me, right? So it's at least possible, though, when you look at, the practices of the Nixon administration and Kissinger himself, for that matter, he made off with all of his telephone transcripts and tried to keep them secret after he left office. It's at least possible that some of these records were destroyed, right, because they became politically inconvenient. Now, in terms of what's left, there was still many, many millions of records left. And eventually when the National Archives began looking at these, as they had to, after 25 years, they're supposed to review these records and decide what can be released. They decided there were far too many, some 28 million records, far too many for them, even to browse. And so what they decided to do is they were going to sample, right? And they were going to take each collection of records according to the tag. TAG stands for Traffic Analysis by Geography and Subject. So this is one of the original metadata fields in these records, tags. And they realized they could use these to sort them into different categories and decide by sampling among them which ones they were going to preserve permanently or which ones they were only going to preserve for 5 or 10 years. And they also decided that some would just get minimal review, some would get more in-depth review. Now, if you ever want to carry out such a project, the one thing I would urge, if you didn't know it already, is not to think that you can do a random sample just by looking at every nth record, right? Because there are patterns in the production of these records. There are weekends and there are holidays, right? So just by looking at every nth record, you can actually deceive yourself into thinking you have a random sample if, for example, a disproportionate number of your records fall on weekends, or the opposite if you don't actually capture weekends. Because of course in the State Department, a lot of the most exciting things happen during weekends. So statisticians will tell you that this doesn't necessarily give you a random sample if you're just looking at every 10,000 record. But that's what they did in the case of the National Archives. Now the other problem is, and I probably don't need to tell you this, if you are going to do a sample, you have to review the whole sample. So it's a little bit like, in this case, the National Archives reviewers, It's like they were conducting an opinion survey. They decided they were going to ask 1,000 Americans who were they going to vote for in the next election. And they decided after talking to 500 of them that they didn't need to talk to any more people, that they already knew what was going to happen, right? So this is the other problem. They didn't actually finish the sample, right, to find what might be in there. And by the way, they didn't save the sample either, as far as I can tell you. The sample itself, actually, if it was a representative sample, would have been hugely helpful, going forward for researchers down the road. If they got some sense, some kind of random sample of the original corpus could have really helped them to figure out, what was missing. Now, we don't know how many records were preserved and how many were deleted. We only know this in terms of the number of tags, right, the different subject categories. But this gives you a sense of how, about 45% were designated for deletion. And this included all the records related to international passports and visas, everything about international sport, international scientific cooperation, educational exchanges, cultural diplomacy. So there are huge parts of America's history of American foreign relations that have been deleted permanently. This to me is, in a way, like the most important thing of all. This is what it looks like when a researcher like me wants to research the Central Foreign Policy Files. This is like it's like it sounds. It's actually the core, collection to understand the history of American foreign relations. It's the Central Foreign Policy Files of the State Department. And again, instead of a finding aid that gives you some sense of file structure and organization, instead what you get is a whole set of databases, which you can search using random keywords, right? Now, keyword searching has been shown to be highly ineffective, right? There are not a lot of studies done of this, but the classic study was one that found that researchers only found about 20% of the relevant records when they were using keyword searching. And they missed some 70% of the records that were actually relevant, or 80%, I should say, rather. And they were highly confident they found everything relevant. That's the other thing. People think when they're using keywords that they're finding what they're looking for. They don't realize how much more they're missing. All right, so that for me, means that a lot of our history as a country, is being stored in places like this. This is the data farm the NSA created in the desert, in other record centers of various kinds. And we may think that someday it will be reviewed, even if it's 0.1% or 1% or 3%. But I think everything we've seen so far in terms of how electronic records collections are being reviewed for eventual release should give us pause and should cause real concern as to what we're likely to see or not see going forward. All right, so this is a part of our talk. I want to have to do this relatively quickly, but I can stop at any point if anything's unclear, and I'll circle back to this during the Q&A. But that central image here, this is the idea, right? I did a story with Columbia Magazine a few years ago about the idea of building an engine, right? A machine learning system that would allow you to rapidly review records and identify sensitive information to decide what could be more rapidly released to the public. And so the artist, created this idea. I wish it looked like this. I wish I had one of these in my office. But instead, what you'll find when you talk to people, doing data science, what they have are databases, and they have a code base, right, of different algorithms to do different kinds of tasks. And so I'm going to walk you through a few of these experiments that we've done. But before I do that, I want to point out that this isn't like a mad scientist up at Columbia doing crazy stuff. This is actually showing you how it is that the Public Interest Declassification Board, the part of our government appointed by Congress and the American president to decide what should be done for all our sake in terms of holding our government to account, they announced all the way back in 2014 that there was no way they can continue with the manual review of records, and that they would have to instead develop new techniques using statistical methods to review records and release them to the public. Now, one reason for that is it's not just that so few records are getting reviewed and released. It's also records that should never have been released are actually getting released to the public. So, for example, this is a page from the CIA assassination manual where it's showing how you could kill everybody in a room, right? Just two people working together can kill everybody in a room. And the CIA was offering instruction on how to do that. This is the kind of record I think doesn't have to be released to the public. Like, we should know this record exists, but we don't actually need to see the step-by-step instructions for mass murder. So that's why the PIDB, the Public Interest Declassification Board, said it was absolutely essential to study and pilot risk management approaches, right? Not where you have zero tolerance for anything sensitive being released, but instead you develop systems for risk tolerance to allow you to better manage that risk. Now, unfortunately, those experiments are not happening, almost none, and I can talk about that during the Q&A, but it's why my colleagues and I at Columbia, we began doing our own experiments. So I'll just give you a few examples. One is we took a database of over 100,000 records from presidential libraries, and we found there are many thousands of examples of records that have been redacted by one official, but were redacted differently by another official. Or in some cases, they would release a record, in this case, 13 years later, and the thing that was originally sensitive, at least part of it, was no longer deemed sensitive. Sometimes it was the opposite. Sometimes things would get redacted later that had been released earlier. But we created this tool in order to identify what individuals are particularly likely to get redacted from the public record. So we found who are the people who are disproportionately likely to have their names redacted. And so we came up with something, we call it America's Top Secrets, or America's Most Redacted. And interestingly, this man, William Pauley, is the only American who made the list. And once you dug in, which is what I did, you can begin to see why. Because as it turns out, Pauley was likely one of the key middlemen in helping to engineer an oil embargo to overthrow the government of Guatemala in 1954. He worked together with American oil companies to cut them off from oil shipments. At least that's my strong suspicion when I look at his record and I look at some of these records. Mr. Name Not Declassified. He was also essential in ensuring that the Guatemalan rebels would have air support. He paid in cash for American Thunderbolt fighters to be delivered to the Guatemalan insurgents, and they then proceeded to use them to wipe out what oil and gas reserves still remained in Guatemala City. So this is an example of how you can do this kind of research using data science techniques, and it also helps you to do history in a way you couldn't otherwise. Now, this is a technique, something called topic modeling, which allows you to automatically cluster records when they have similar kinds of language. This is just showing you the first words in each of these topic areas. In fact, every word in that corpus, of over 100,000 records, would be enumerated in these topics. I'm just showing you the first three to get a sense of what they're about. And what you could see is we're showing how they were redacted. And the most sensitive, topic areas had to do with covert operations. The least sensitive had to do with international aid and trade. It's not necessarily what everyone would expect. A lot of people who think of American foreign policy as a capitalist cabal would be surprised, I think, at how many of these records about international trade negotiations and so on actually have very few redactions. They tend to get released quickly. But the one thing I think almost everybody would think, would have to be highly sensitive is records related to unidentified flying objects. So this is an experiment that Hannah Wallach did. She's a data scientist at Microsoft Research. And what she wanted to know is if you use topic modeling to cluster records in terms of the ones that are most and least likely to get released or to take the longest to get released, what you can do is you can sort the records, say, that are about nuclear weapons from the ones that are about UFOs. And what she found, is that one takes a lot longer to get released than the other, but it maybe not the one that you think. It takes 57 years for records related to nuclear weapons to get released on average. It only takes about 17 years for records related to unidentified flying objects to get released. This is the exception that proves the rule. This is actually a declassified document. It took over 50 years, but this was a flying saucer the Air Force was trying to build in order to deliver nuclear weapons and carry out surveillance and reconnaissance in advance of nuclear strikes. So to me, this is in a way kind of the exception that makes the rule. But, I often think to myself, if the Pentagon really did have proof of an alien threat, I think they would tell us right away, right? In the same way that they tried to tell us that the Soviets had more bombers than we did and more missiles than we did, or that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction. Far from avoiding panic, I think the American government regularly tries to stow panic in order to make people think that we need even more defense appropriations. And this is the last experiment I'll show you. This is where we used a machine learning technique, a machine classification. In a way, it's a little bit like what Netflix does and Amazon does when they predict what products you might like. But in this case, we're using the data to predict whether documents would be classified or declassified, or unclassified rather. And we actually got pretty reasonable results, better than 90%, even though we didn't have any access to the original classified records, just using the ones that were released. And we found that, in fact, a lot of the false negatives, the ones that seemingly showed, how it is that our algorithm had failed, right, to find something that was genuinely sensitive. This is just giving you, breakdown for different kinds of classification tasks. We found that, in fact, these records probably should never have been classified to begin with. So we found a lot of human error. In this case, a hotel reservation that, as you can see, was classified as secret. On the other hand, we also found records that the algorithm did not, identify as likely to be unclassified. In fact, the algorithm predicted it would be classified. And in that case, we found that these were records that were likely highly sensitive at the time, and in some cases maybe still are. So in this case, this had to do with a kidnapping of the president of Cyprus. It was information that was passed on by a confidential source, and yet this record was unclassified. So these kinds of techniques can also help you uncover at scale human error in processes of classification and declassification. This is the last thing I'll leave you with. If you're curious about how large language models might figure in this, systems like ChatGPT, they may actually play a very large role, and I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A. If you try to ask ChatGPT about America's top secrets, you rather save the money and not buy my book. Unfortunately, ChatGPT has guardrails that prevent it from answering questions that seem to relate to classified, even formally classified information. But it's certainly the case, and the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists had an article about this very recently. It's certainly the case that bad actors will use similar kinds of systems to learn things that they probably shouldn't know. And I think that's all the more reason why we need more research in this area to model this threat and see what can be done about it. All right, so that's what I'll leave you with. And once again, I want to thank ARMA Metro NYC, and I want to thank all of you. And I'm happy to take your questions. And I see I already have some questions, like, for example, what would be a good alternative to keyword searching? I'm so glad you asked, Leslie. If you go, and now I'm going to do a little self-promotion, but if you go to history-lab.org, you'll find that my group at Columbia, we've tried to develop techniques beyond keyword searching that give you a sense of the content of a database. So before you just start randomly trying out different words and phrases, instead you can begin by seeing, like, who are the people that are most heavily represented in those records, which countries or locations are the most frequently cited or referenced. You also see information about the topics, so we use topic modeling. So that allows you to begin looking, not just in terms of whether this or that name appears, but you can begin getting a sense of all the different names that appear. It also will allow you to search not just the particular version of the name that you used, but it also will find variants, right? And more than that, it will allow you to find, that particular name in the context of a particular topic, whether it's about, Kissinger and nuclear arms control negotiation, but maybe related to China, right? So you can try various combinations, not just of various words, right, but of different topics and locations and whatnot. And in terms of the locations and the names and so on, again, it's with named entity recognition, another data science technique. You can identify all of the versions of that name and versions of that location, so that your user doesn't go away thinking that there's nothing there. Now, having said that, one thing I found kind of interesting, we've surveyed our users, and we find that it's hard to know whether a given user is going to appreciate that kind of discovery experience. There are many people now that are so used to doing keyword searching, they just want to plug in their keywords. And so we certainly give people the ability, to try keyword searching to see what they can find. And, I work with partners who, found that it can also be helpful and possible now when people find particular records they find to be relevant. You can develop systems now that will automatically retrieve other records that are semantically similar, right? And you can also adjust the ways in which it's similar, whether it's based on the language or the particular date, so you can find everything happening on a particular date, for example, or also, like, as I mentioned, the names of people and places and organizations and so on. All right. Apologies for the audio, by the way. I hope you can hear me now. And I'm happy to go deeper into any of these aspects if anybody would like to hear it. One thing I'm curious to hear though, when I got to the point I was talking about, what percentage of records get reviewed, what percentage of records get released. I've heard it said that when records get classified, it actually helps ensure those records are less likely to get destroyed. So that I think is an interesting question, right? If the processes are different, right, when dealing with classified records. Now, certainly, as we've seen, law enforcement is much more interested in cases in which classified records go missing, right? And if people have taken those records when they shouldn't have, they seem very little interest, at least in terms of risk of prosecution, when unclassified records get destroyed. So it's at least possible that there's greater protection for classified records. But I'm also curious, in terms of the realm of electronic records, which of course is the world we're living in now, what do we think in terms of what percent of those records might get preserved long term, even when we're talking about public records? Does the old National Archives rule of thumb, like 1 to 3%, does that still apply? Or is it still more, or is it now more like what Jason Barron is saying, that perhaps only 0.1% will get reviewed? And if they're not getting reviewed now, what confidence do we have that they'll get reviewed down the road? So that's a question for you all. These are the kinds of questions that I have for you. But I see I have a question from David Prather. He's asking, are there underlying taxonomies or classification schemes that help to organize the information? Yeah, absolutely. One great thing about working with these Central Foreign Policy files, and I'm definitely not a Luddite, like I embrace the potential, for using records like this. One reason is that they're so rich with metadata. So the Central Foreign Policy files, like a given State Department telegram from 1973, will have 68 different kinds of metadata, right? And that can include, everything like the tags that I just mentioned. It also includes things like handling instructions. So, as we heard recently, like with the Teixeira case and others, like things that were designated as no foreign, right? No foreigners are allowed to see. These are things now you can use to sift and sort through these records. You can also see which records have priority, which ones are meant to go to the highest level policymakers. So these are examples of ways you can now leverage that kind of metadata to do all kinds of interesting analysis. And so like we've used metadata like this to try to develop models to predict whether a given record is likely to be judged historic by archivists and historians. And we're working on systems like that, because we'd like to do something about this, 0.1% to 3% question to see whether there are ways that we can help records managers identify the records that are more likely to be judged significant. All right, so I had a question from Gina about thoughts on classified documents being removed from the White House. So the professionals in this field will tell you that this has been going on for many decades. They'll tell you stories, of how they would go to the garage, of this or that former official. And in most cases like this, somebody would be sheepishly revealing how it is that they had inadvertently, they'll say, remove records when they shouldn't have. So in many cases, it's a simple mistake. But in some cases, it's more than that, right? And I think in the two cases that we're giving a lot of attention to, like Trump and Biden, I sometimes think it's a little bit like the difference between, let's say you had a roommate, when they moved out, they accidentally took your coffee mug, right? And they called you up and they told you about it. Maybe it was 6 months later, but eventually they say, oh, I have your coffee mug. Can I take you out for coffee? I apologize. I shouldn't have done it. And then on the other hand, you might have had a roommate once who moved out and took like a lot of your stuff and some of it kind of valuable. And then they claimed it was theirs all along, and they hired lawyers and refused to give it back, and they wanted to litigate it with you. So that to me, I think on the face of it, it's hard to see like how in the case of Biden and Trump, we're dealing with pretty different examples here. The volume of material is also rather different. I haven't seen any evidence that Biden was even aware that he had these records, and maybe it'll come out eventually. Trump, on the other hand, liked to brag, about the classified records that he still possessed, and he apparently was in the habit of showing them to people. Now, having said that, I don't think Biden gets a free pass, because one of the records they found was in an envelope that was marked personal, right? And so I asked myself, in most settings, right, who is it who gets to decide something's personal? and puts it in that envelope. I mean, that to me is like an interesting question. Like who was it who decided that something was personal when in fact this was a public record, right? I mean, it was still classified and apparently secret, but it's a public record in the sense that these are our records, right? These belong to the American people. So I think, I think we have good reason to ask these questions. And if it was up to me, we'd be asking questions not just about classified records, but other records, non-classified records that have also been destroyed or gone missing. Okay, so I also have a question about what's to be done on the front end, records creation or improved declassification or discovery. So I think the first thing is to review the well-intentioned plans of the past and to see how they've gone awry. Richard, I'm really struck when I talk with people who work in classified environments, how the idea of portion marking, it's become a curse. So the intention was good. Like the idea was that you would take the portions of a given record, whether it's typically individual paragraphs or what have you, and you would identify each paragraph in terms of whether it would be classified at one level or another, whether it's top secret or what have you. Now just imagine, like you're trying to compose an email or a memorandum, and every paragraph you got to decide if the information is classified at what level. So what do most people do? Most people just classify everything, because it's easier. And in some cases, they're actually preemptively classifying information. Even if it's a Starbucks appointment, they're asking a colleague about going for coffee. Sometimes even that communications get classified as top secret, no joke. Why? Because they fear it might become part of an email thread, and they might start exchanging information that's actually sensitive. So they'll preemptively classify the very first and what they think might be a thread of email. Now, I think what has to be done at the front end is we have to begin creating systems, front to back, information management systems that are tracking what information is getting classified at what level, and then down the road, like how that information is getting reviewed and released to the public. Because when I liken, these systems, and they call it in data science, they call it a classification problem, actually. These systems operated by Amazon and Netflix and so on, they're capturing the data in real time, like the things that you watch and the things that you buy and the things you don't buy and don't watch, and the way you rate these different products or these different films and TV shows. They're capturing all that data in order to make better predictions as whether this or that record should be classified, whether this or that record can be declassified, or whether it has to get redacted. All that information could be fed into a system that would at the least begin identifying outliers, right? It would show you like which individuals tend to be classifying everything, which individuals are classifying records at the highest level that no one else is classifying. Now, that is going to give you, the old saying like garbage in, garbage out. The system, the machine learning system, if all the training data that's being captured is people overclassifying information, that it's going to continue recommending overclassification. But in fact, you could begin tweaking that system, begin adjusting for the fact that most people think half or even 95% of records probably shouldn't get classified. You could begin adjusting that system so that you could help people begin making distinctions, right? Nudging them in the direction of classifying at lower levels, right? And also in some cases identifying records like some of Hillary Clinton's email, that probably should have been classified and aren't, right? So that's what I think has to be done at the front end. Now you can train people all day long, right? And a lot of that money we've seen is spent on training. But the fact is there is a powerful culture of secrecy within our government that's very difficult to overcome. And there's also a certain psychology, and psychologists have actually studied this. When you stamp something as classified, people are more likely to value it as important and reliable, even if that is just a random piece of paper. So they're really powerful cultural factors. All the incentives are for classifying information. Nobody has ever gotten fired, as far as I can tell, or even disciplined for overclassifying. So all the incentives and all the psychology militates, towards overclassification. And that's why we need systems to begin capturing this data so we can analyze it more carefully and we can begin nudging people in the right direction. So I have a question from Ralph about the evolution of AI, automating and assisting. So we've come a long ways. When I say we, I don't mean to take credit for the work my colleagues in data science, but just to give you an example, I used an automatic summarization technique about 5 years ago for a collection that I didn't have the right to display in its entirety, right? I was lucky enough to get a publisher to share a database of classified records, and the condition was that we would just summarize the content. And you know what? Those summaries weren't that great. But look at what you can do now with a large language model like ChatGPT. It's really quite astonishing. So that's why I would say, like, the kind of techniques that you're seeing employed now, it represents the floor and not the ceiling, right? And some of the techniques we use, like topic modeling, for example, didn't even exist 20 years ago. And some of these other techniques, like named entity recognition, they're getting better all the time. And so that's why I'd say that, you know, people in the field, you know, I'm sure many of you do this already. It's really worthwhile, like, checking one's priors, your assumptions, and looking at the new work that comes along just to see whether it may reveal things that could potentially be useful in your own work. All right, how do I anticipate the government will be okay relying solely on AI tools to declassify records? So I don't think we're at the point now where they will rely solely on AI tools. I was at a conference recently where they had actually people from the data science field appearing on a panel and asked that very question, like, do you see this happening? And no, I don't see it happening in the near term. And one reason, it's basically a political problem. People think, you know, if something goes wrong, I can't fire the algorithm. So, you know, there is still that political problem. Like, people want to have someone they can hold responsible. So they're less likely to trust in systems, or at least allow systems to operate independently. Now, having said that, I've also talked with a longtime professional at one of our larger intelligence agencies, and this was a conversation 7 or 8 years ago when we first started discussing, like, what was possible. And he told me that he would actually prefer a system, even if that system made errors, to the current situation where he's trusting in humans, right? Because he knows those humans are making errors. The difference is he doesn't know how many errors those humans are making. And I think the first thing that we have to do is we have to run studies for what they call intercoder reliability. We need to see the people who are responsible for sensitivity review, to what extent do they actually agree with one another when they're reviewing records, deciding what can be released. This is a very common kind of study that's done in academia all the time. We call this an intercoder reliability study. Maybe some of you have done that in your own organizations. But unless we do that research, unless we establish what the threshold is, right, the degree of agreement that we can get on humans, then we don't know what the benchmark is that AI systems have to either meet or beat, right? So once we get to the point, we know, you know, what reliability we expect from humans doing sensitivity review, that should be the standard then that we should test AI systems against. It's a little bit like self-driving cars, you know? We're going to get to the point where these self-driving cars may actually be safer than humans, and then we're going to have to make a decision as a society, you know, can we trust these systems to do this work? At the moment, all we're talking about is using these systems to prioritize those records that reviewers need to scrutinize more closely. All right, so lastly, I have a question from John. Is there a sense of what percentage of classified material is actually required to be protected? Yeah, so, you know, it's interesting, but when you talk to people in government, they'll say that they estimate some 50 to 95% of information that's classified doesn't actually have to be classified. Now, just think of the waste, right? I mean, we all know that these kinds of records, when they're designated as sensitive, they require additional protections. It can be costly, right? And it becomes a problem for an organization over the longer run. And unfortunately, this has become a metastasizing problem for our government. And it's the reason, one of the root causes of why these records are showing up all over the place, and why we've been seeing these catastrophic leaks, you know, where literally millions of records get released that really could kill people. It's because we've lost the ability to control the production and protection of sensitive information. So you information governance professionals, we historians, and also I think archivists will tell you the same thing, and the archivists among you I hope will agree, we're all in this together, you know, and we have to begin drawing attention to this problem, because I think the general public is just blithely unaware, you know, of what this means and what could be coming down the line. I really want to thank you all. This has been really interesting for me. Your questions are excellent, and I hope we can bring more people into the conversation as well.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.
We've
Looks
covered
like
pretty much
we've covered pretty much
all the questions.
all the questions.
Let me begin by giving a special thanks to you, Matt, for what I'm sure everyone will agree was an insightful presentation. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Rich. I also want to thank David again, and I want to thank all the organizers and all of you for attending. Thank you so much. I'm very easy to find. If you just look up Connolly at Columbia, I'm pretty easy to find if anybody wants to reach out.
And folks, if you didn't hear me in the beginning, Matt just recently released another book, The Declassification Engine.
What history reveals about America's top secrets. So please make sure to pick up a copy today.
Thanks again, Matt.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Before I let you go, I'd like to say there are many benefits to being a member of ARMA International and your local chapter. With over 5,500 members internationally, there are many opportunities to connect with your RIM IG peers. In addition, there is a vast amount of career and job resources available to you as a member. I'm sure you all can agree that there is no time like the present to invest in yourself. To find out more information about and learn about potential incentives to becoming a member, please feel free to reach out to our VP of Membership, Leslie Smith, at leslie.smith@armanyc.com. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and we will connect throughout the day. Thank you.